Okay, hi everyone, this is Joe from High Comp Performance Engines, and we're going to do a carburetor to EFI test, a back-to-back carburetor to EFI test. Now I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, Joe, I've seen hundreds of these on the internet, and you have, but this one's different. I don't think those other tests were fair. They were not fair, and I'll tell you why. Because they start with a carbureted car, it's got carburetors, and it's got a distributor on it. They put EFI on it, take the carburetors off, and at the same time when they put a computer on it, like a Haltech or another aftermarket ECU or similar, they hook up the ignition and they run 3D ignition at the same time as they are converting it to fuel injection. So it's not really fair in that you've not only replaced the carburetors, but you've also taken the control of the ignition timing away from the distributor with its 2D ignition curve. This Torana is different. This Torana I set up with carbies and a computer on it many years ago. Well, I put the carbies on many years ago, 4 or 5 years ago now. It's been running happily with carburetors. And then over a year ago, we fitted a Haltech ECU and we fitted the various sensors. We fitted TPS sensor, coolant temp sensor, air temp sensor, and we've been running the car with 3D ignition control with the carburetors for over a year, okay? So when we do our EFI conversion, we're going to be putting Jenvey throttle bodies on it. We are really and truly only replacing the carburetors with EFI. The ignition control is going to remain the same, okay? And that's the difference between our test and all the other tests, okay? We're going to be doing the fairest carby to EFI conversion that you've ever seen, okay? And we'll show you as we go through the process. We'll take a baseline dyno run, we'll go for a drive so that you've got that on-road sort of experience, and we've got the dyno, and then we're going to go for a drive with fuel injection, and we're going to obviously dyno tune it with the fuel injection. We'll show you the dyno as we go, and we'll explain everything, and we'll have the world's fairest carburetor to EFI test. Okay, I just wanted to show you what happens on the dyno when we're not at full throttle. So this is some cruising of the car still on carburetors. And you'll be able to see that the air-fuel ratio under cruising conditions is not so bad. We're actually running in the low 14s. So you can see there we're running 14.3 or 14.2. There's our green line, which gives a graphical representation of that. And the horsepower loads are basically what you would be driving on the road. So it's not too bad at all with the carbies. As I said, it's very, very highly tuned on the carburetors. It's not some gas guzzling thing that's pouring fuel down the engine unregulated. And this should be taken into account before we go and do our power run. Okay, I should point out at this juncture that this is a Holden 6 engine with a 9-port cylinder head. It is not the 12-port cylinder head. So it's not exactly a single barrel per cylinder. That means the cylinder 1 and 2 are Siamesed, and 3 and 4 are Siamesed, and 5 and 6 are Siamesed. And it has a camshaft in it that's just a mild street cam of specification unknown, but it's just like a camshaft that you would have in a warmed over street motor. So there's our baseline run today of 159 horsepower. We did another couple of runs and we actually got 160 horsepower for the baseline. But today this is the baseline. Now some people might be wondering, why is there a white line on top of the green power line? So the green power line is today's run, and the white power line is a previous run that we've done on this very car. As I said, I've been looking after this car for 7 years or so. So it's been on my dyno many times, and the white line represented a power run or a tune with a different diff ratio and different tyre diameters and different tyre widths at the rear. So you can see how the diff ratio and the tyre widths do make a big difference to power. But for today, our baseline is 159 and 160. So all of our tuning from here on in with the EFI will be based on a baseline of 159, 160 horsepower at the wheels. Well, that is really good. The car's fast, it's responsive. It's one of my favourite cars to drive with carburettors. Look, I've been looking after this car for 6 or 7 years. I did the carby installation on it. It's tuned to perfection. It's really good. It's going to be really hard to beat when we put the fuel injection on it. We'll see how we go. Okay, so we've converted to EFI now. Here's our EFI fuel pump, which has been installed into the standard Torana GTR tank. We've used a 60 PSI LS style fuel pump, so the fuel pressure is a constant 60 PSI. We've also changed the fuel pressure gauge to a EFI fuel pressure gauge, and the fuel pressure is not manifold referenced, so it's a constant 60 pounds all the time. Okay. We also have to talk a little bit about the trumpets that are on there, which I'll explain in a few moments. But basically the trumpet length was a big problem on the dyno. We struggled with the trumpet length there that we've got, and it caused a lot of grief. And our tuning took an unexpected turn with the trumpets. It turned into a trumpet tuning session, and I'll explain that in a moment. Okay, so here's the car running on the dyno in the middle of us tuning the fuel side of the equation. And you can see there on the computer screen on the far left, we have a big target lambda of 14.7 there. And then on the right, or almost the far right, we have the actual lambda or actual air fuel ratio. So now this is the beauty of EFI. We can keep a very tight control over the air fuel ratio, and we can run stoic for as long as we like, and we can have our short-term fuel trims, which you'll see there on the far right, just next to the actual lambda. We've got the computer plussing and minusing percentages of fuel. So this is what we can't do with carburettors. We can't have this tight control. And then once we reach a certain throttle percentage, we can go and leave the closed loop behind, and we can go into open loop, but we can still keep a tight control over the air fuel ratio. Now, this is why I've called this the world's fairest carburetor to EFI conversion, because this Haltech computer existed with the carburettors. We had the computer hooked up, running with the carburettors for over a year. We had fully 3D mappable ignition. We had a TPS sensor connected to the Weber carburettors. We had an air temp sensor, a coolant temp sensor, and so on and so forth. So we could have things like an idle timing map. We could have a full throttle timing map, and we can have corrections for cold start timing and for hot air timing. As the air heats up, we can subtract timing for engine protection and all these wonderful things. So that puts the carburettors on another level, and that's why the carburettors ran so good, because we had all this computer-controlled ignition timing, and that can make a huge difference to the way a carburetted car runs. So all we're doing is we're changing to fuel injection, yes, and now instead of carbies, we've got fuel being injected by an injector and tightly controlled by the ECU, but we already had those timing functions in place. So the car's level of drivability and cold starting and under most conditions was very tightly controlled with the timing. So
we're not taking that away from the computer or from the car. We're just adding the fuel injection, and this is what makes it a fair test, because normally people take a car that's running absolutely rubbish on carburetors, they convert it to fuel injection. They also convert it from points ignition or from 2D distributor controlled ignition or with a 2D timing curve. They put it on the 3D ignition and they put all those ignition functions in there, and they say, oh, wow, look how wonderful it runs now. The difference was chalk and cheese, and I'm sure it is, but they're doing the ignition at the same time, and that's not what we're doing here.
Okay guys, we have to talk about ram tubes. The ram tubes caused us a lot of grief. We had some big problems. So when we put on the Jenvey throttle bodies, we were hoping that we could use the Weber tubes, okay? But the Weber tubes slide down inside the carburetor like that. They don't do that on the Jenveys. They're a bolt-on tube. So for the Jenveys, we need a flange on the ram tube so that we can bolt onto the throttle body. All right. Now, to be fair, like we want a fair test. We want the world's fairest test. So we can't have the fairest test if we're not using the same tubes. Now, we tried to buy a very similar tube to the Weber tube in taper and diameter and bell mouth. We just couldn't do it. We had trouble trying to find the right length. So we bought some Jenvey tubes, which are as close as possible in height to the Weber tubes as you can get, so that bit there goes down inside the carby, and you can see there they're pretty much the same height. However, when we put them on, we lost power. Well, we didn't make as much power as the baseline. So remember, the baseline was 160 horsepower. We couldn't even make the baseline. So we had to have a sit down and have a think about it. And what I sort of theorised is that the bell mouth on this tube is so large, on the new tube, it's so large that the effective length of the tube is probably a little bit shorter than 60 mil, okay? So you can see the bell mouth on the Weber tube, it's much narrower. So the effective length, what I mean by the effective length is this bell mouth is so large that the air doesn't even start to accelerate until it sort of gets a little bit of the way down the tube, thus making it like a shorter tube, okay? But we couldn't even make the baseline. I think it was like, baseline was 160 and we were at like 156, somewhere around there. So what we did was we did an experiment. We put the Weber tube inside the Jenvey tube and just taped them together, okay? Total length 135 mil. Power shot right up above the baseline, 167 horsepower. Go figure. But this is sort of a cheat because we're getting the power with longer tubes. Okay, so then what we tried to do was we tried to get a tube which was much more similar to the Weber tube, which is a bolt-on with a flange. So you can see there that this one's a touch longer, but that's the best we could get. But the bell mouth, even though this has a radius lip, the bell mouth is much more similar to the Weber bell mouth. The diameter across here is much closer to this, even though this has got a radius lip, all right? So we put these ones on, similar in length to the Weber tube, lost power. Best we could manage was 157, 158, not even the baseline, So we had to have a sit down and have a think about it. The only thing that we could think of, or that I can think of, is that the fuel is introduced in the Weber carburetor further back up here. It's introduced through the auxiliary venturi, and it's introduced right into the middle of the barrel of the carburetor. So it has a little bit more time to atomize, and it's the fuel has a little bit more time to atomize, and it's introduced a little bit further back, so it's got a little bit more time, and it's introduced in the middle. Whereas the Jenvey injectors, they squirt fuel in up on the high side of the butterfly, right down the end of the carburetor where it joins the manifold. Okay. Now that's not a reflection on Jenvey or anything like that. Most injection throttle bodies that you would buy have an injector which is positioned very, very similar to the Jenvey. Okay. But this is where we are. This is why we're testing. Where there was definitely a difference between the EFI and the Carby definitely had the advantage. So what we did in the end was we used these tubes with a 60mm spacer so that we could get 135mm total length, because remember our testing, and you'll see this in the dyno run videos, you'll see the two tubes taped together for a total length of 135mm. So when we purchased these, we needed a 60mm spacer to go onto the end of that to make 135mm. So at the end of the day, we've ended up with 168 rear wheel horsepower, which is 8 more horsepower higher than the baseline, but we needed a long ram tube to get it. Okay, so it's not exactly a fair test because it doesn't use the same length as the Weber, but we did that test and we lost. We couldn't even make the baseline. That was a dead cold start, and the car's idling very nicely. With the EFI, of course, you'd expect the starting to be pretty good, and it is. Driving on fuel injection, and just one of the things that I've noticed on this car, which I wasn't quite expecting, is that when I decelerate the vehicle's dead silent. There's no burbling out the exhaust. So when you have Webers or carburettors, and when you decelerate, there's a burbling out the exhaust, right? And that's because it's burning a little bit of fuel, okay? It's pulling in fuel on decel or overrun. But with EFI, we can use a function called deceleration fuel cut. And it's a function that I really like using because it saves fuel and it helps with engine wear, and it can also help prevent a fire in an accident. Ask me how I know. But when we have the decel fuel cut on the EFI and we decelerate, it's dead silent. And some people like that, other people don't like it so much. So if I decelerate here, I'll just try to show you. So that's a big long decel and no noise. Well, that felt really good. You got to remember that this car with the Webers on it felt really, really good anyway. It was very highly developed, very highly tuned with the carburettors. And it's not just the engine. The suspension feels great. The diff ratios feel great. The steering feels great. Everything's really, really good on this car. So it was very, very highly tuned with the Webers. Tuned professionally and tuned very well. So the on-road feel with the EFI, I can't really feel a difference. Okay. However, we know that with EFI we can have tight control over the air fuel ratio, and we know that we can run in closed loop and we can run
14.7 to 1 under all conditions, and we can have deceleration fuel cut and all those really nice fuel saving things. So that's a win for EFI, and we know that the engine's going to live longer and the oil changes are going to be extended because we don't have contamination of the oil with the fuel, because we've got a tight control over the AFR, right? But the on-road feel, the on-road difference between the throttle bodies, the injection, and the carburettors, there's nothing in it. So if you have a carburetted car and you want to convert to EFI simply for the sheer power of it, you're going to have to think really hard about it. Not every engine's like this, I know. Some engines have twin Hollies, some are V8s, some are 4 cylinders. But if you're converting from Carby to EFI just for the sheer horsepower, you're going to have to think really, really hard about what system you've got and what you want to achieve. If you want to stay with the carburettors, spend some money on having them tuned correctly by a professional, and you'll see really good results. They'll run better than if you're just turning the screws at home with the screwdriver yourself. Also think about putting an ECU on the carburettors to have full 3D ignition management or 3D ignition timing, and that'll put your carbies on another level. Look, carbies aren't for everyone. If you want EFI, absolutely, sure. EFI has many, many benefits, as we've discussed. And if you've got a turbocharger or supercharger, you really need EFI. You can't really do turbocharging without it, without EFI. Turbocharging in carburettors can be done well, but that's a whole nother video. Okay, so there is the net result of all of our efforts, 168.6 horsepower, up from the baseline of 160. So that's with the fuel injection and with the longest possible tubes, which we needed to get that power. Okay, so here are the two runs laid on top of each other. The blue line is the baseline and the purple line is the sum total of all of the tuning and the tubes. We can see there the air-fuel ratio down the bottom. So our the solid white line down the bottom is the target air-fuel ratio, which we've set at 12.7 to 1. And there's our nice straight purple line with the EFI, and it shows how much leaner we can run the engine over and above the carburettors. So the carburettors, the blue line is very, very low. It's showing about 10 to 1, but the EFI line is the purple line, and it's much more flatter and much more closer to the target. So I hope you think that our test is the world's fairest carburettor to EFI conversion, and I hope you enjoy it.